They did give us no scrubs.
No, they're not making money off of it. They should have said on the Grammys, we're broke.
All right, Shanae's here and Kyla is here. We'll give Victoria just a minute, see if she also shows up.
Okay, I got
Okay,
in gold.
TLC, hands down. I barely remember In Vogue, to be honest.
Top video or the name? Top video or the name? Ooh, top video or the name? Sean Combs or the name?
All right, we're gonna.
Mainly because I don't know if people like, because top video is still
All right, we're gonna look at some stuff today, and there. Will you close the door for you? The nice thing for you guys is that there isn't an assignment to go along with it. It's just information. And this one is actually kind of a fun thing to learn about. I know that Mike sometimes also teaches about it and gave me these two posters up here. But we're going to look at logical fallacies, and I have attached a link to a page about logical fallacies, and we're just going to kind of go through each of the logical fallacies. A logical fallacy is basically a flaw in reasoning. They're like tricks or illusions of thought, and they are oftentimes very sneakily used by politicians or the media to fool people. And they're also used not so cleverly by people who are just trying to win an argument at any cost. This website that we're going to look at has been designed to help you identify and call out dodgy logic wherever it might crop up. So we're going to look at all these different examples. There's all these different names for them, like the straw man argument or the slippery slope or ad hominem. You do not have to know those terms. The point of looking at all these is so that you guys can recognize flaws in logic when you see them and be able to kind of call that out, which will be helpful not only in the multiple choice section, but also if you're looking at sources in your synthesis essay, if you are trying to agree or disagree with whatever prompt is in the argument essay. And it can even help you with rhetorical analysis, and particularly when you get to like satirical rhetorical analysis, which I don't know if you guys know what that means at this point, but before we write our next rhetorical analysis essay, we will look at satire a lot. And sometimes satire uses these flaws in logic. So we're going to look at each of these individually. Each one will just take a minute. So this is not like I know there are a lot of them, and this is probably not even all the kinds that there are, but we're going to look at these and then we're going to read a story that's a really fun example of a lot of these. So first of all, you have the straw man argument, which is when you misrepresent someone's argument to make it easier to attack. Like you basically say that they're arguing something other than what they're actually arguing. This happens in Facebook arguments all the freaking time. So their example here, they have some fun, cute little examples here, and all these examples are also on my poster up there, but that is very far away and high and hard to read. So their example here is after Will said that we should put more money into health and education, Warren responded by saying that he was surprised that Will hates our country so much that he wants to leave it defenseless by cutting military spending. Will didn't say anything about hating our country. Will didn't say anything about cutting military spending. He just said that we should put more money into health and education. So Warren is totally misrepresenting what the argument actually is. Yeah, Warren sucks. It is called yourlogicalfallacyis.com, and it's linked on Canvas. Let's wait on it. False cause is where you presume that a real or perceived relationship between things means that one is the cause of the other, which that happens a lot. People confuse correlation for causation, and it's not necessarily the case. So in this example, Pointing to a fancy chart, Roger shows how temperatures have been rising over the past few centuries, whilst at the same time the number of pirates have been decreasing. Thus, pirates cool the world and global warming is a hoax. That's silly. Of course of course pirates don't have anything to do with global warming, but because both of these things are true, they're assuming that one has caused the other, and that's not logical. I really want this to just go back to the page when I'm trying to go back to the page. Okay, appeal to emotion, which we know is a good technique that people use to appeal to their audiences sometimes, but sometimes it can be used in a manipulative way to manipulate an emotional response in place of a valid or compelling argument. So for example, Luke didn't want to eat his sheep's brains with chopped liver and Brussels sprouts, but his father told him to think about the poor, starving children in a third world country who weren't fortunate enough to have any food at all. Don't you want to finish your food so that the people starving in Africa aren't going without? I mean, it's not really any.
I'm more my older brother. My dad told my older brother that. He said, "Oh, we're not in Africa."
Yeah, that's the thing. It doesn't have any direct impact on it.
He said, "We're not in Africa. We don't know anyone from Africa. It doesn't matter."
The fallacy is that if you presume that because something's been poorly argued, that the argument itself must be wrong, which is not always the case. Sometimes people's argument is correct, it's just not argued well. So the example here is recognizing that Amanda had committed a fallacy in arguing that we should eat healthy food because a nutritionist said it was popular. Elise said that we should therefore eat bacon double cheeseburgers every day. No, like neither of those is argued well. Pointing out somebody else's fallacy doesn't mean that your argument is good or correct. Slippery slope, you've probably heard of before, or at least kind of understand what that term means. It's like if we allow A to happen, then Z will eventually happen too, therefore A shouldn't happen. And I'm going to give you a different example than theirs just because it makes me think of a particular kid who basically is so like high strung about his grades that he's like, if I fail this test, then I'm going to fail this class and I'm going to fail the year and I'm going to be held back and I won't graduate on time. And then I won't go to college. I won't get a good job. Like failing one test doesn't mean that all these other things are going to happen. That's just like kind of it's a slippery slope. It's where you like spiral sort of into this thing that doesn't make any sense and isn't really connected. Come on. Ad hominem. This was actually the one that I was mentioning as you were leaving yesterday, where you attack your opponent's character or personal traits in an attempt to undermine their argument. People do that all the time, yeah. And I mean, you see it in politics for sure. We saw a lot of it during election season where, and I mean, like both candidates do this, like despite who you voted for, or I mean, you guys didn't vote, you're not old enough, but despite who you wanted to win, you could kind of recognize it in both situations. Like Donald Trump would be like, well, we shouldn't listen to anything that Creepy Joe has to say. And Biden would be like, well, he's proven himself to be an insane person, so we shouldn't listen to what he has to say, instead of taking the actual arguments for what they are. It's just attacking the person's character. I'm not even going to pretend that I know how to pronounce this one, but like I said, to cookie, what? And again, you don't have to know these terms. This is more just to point out all these flaws in logic and how they can be used. This is where you avoid having to engage with criticism by turning it back on the accuser. It's basically like just having a spat instead of arguing. So their example here, Nicole identified that Hannah had committed a logical fallacy, but instead of addressing the substance of her claim, Hannah accused Nicole of committing a logical fallacy earlier on in the conversation. It's almost like, I know you are, but what am I? Like saying, if someone says, you weren't right about that thing that you just said, and the person comes back with, well, you weren't right about the thing that you said earlier, so why should I be right about this thing? Like, let's just all try to be right, you know? Personal incredulity. Come on. Being incredulous or disbelieving. God, I see this one so often. Because you found something difficult to understand or you're not aware of how it works, you act like it's just not true. That's very silly. For example, Kirk drew a picture of a fish and a human and with effusive disdain asked Richard if he really thought we were stupid enough to believe that a fish somehow turned into a human through just like random things happening over time, aka evolution. He doesn't understand how it happened, so it's not true. And people kind of, not to get too hot button with the topics here, but people act that way about science all the time. Like, I don't understand it, so I'm just gonna say it's not true. Special pleading is where you move the goalpost or make up an exception when your claim was shown to be false. I like their example here. This guy claimed to be psychic, but when his abilities were tested under proper scientific conditions, they magically disappeared. And then he explained that by saying that one had to have faith in his abilities for them to work. Like, you can't add this extra thing and like, well, my argument only makes sense if you think about it this way. That's not good logic. You shouldn't have to, like, things should be true or they shouldn't be. We're on this one. Loaded question. You ask a question that had a presumption built into it so that it couldn't be answered without appearing guilty. And see that kind of stuff in debates all the time.
Whoa.
This is a look. I'm in this example.
What do you mean I'm asking all these questions? That's a simple question.
I like this one a lot. I'm in the example of this one. Grace and Helen were both romantically interested in Brad. One day, with Brad sitting within earshot, Grace asked in an inquisitive tone whether Helen was still having problems with her drug habit.
Oh, that's right.
Petty. That's so petty.
That's not petty. That's fighting words.
Oh, Helen, I noticed that Brad's over there, but Helen, are you still having that drug problem that you were having before? Hilarious. Hilarious, but not a good arguing strategy. Burden of proof is when you say the burden of proof lies not with the person making the claim, but with someone else to disprove. So, and this is, I mean, this kind of applies to like court cases and stuff too. Bertrand declares that a teapot is in orbit around the sun between the Earth and Mars, and because no one can prove him wrong, his claim is therefore a valid one. So basically, like, whatever I say is right unless you can prove me wrong. And you can't always prove people wrong, even when they're saying silly things.
So why say no? I don't know.
Like if you say, okay, so for example, if you said Ms. McClellan should be teaching because she doesn't have a teaching degree, I can prove that wrong because I can show you my degree and my transcripts and everything. If you said Ms. McClellan shouldn't be a teacher because one time she punched a kid in the face, and I'd be like, well, no, I didn't. And you're like, well, you have to prove it then. Like, it's true unless you can show me evidence that you've never punched a kid in the face, which of course I haven't, by the way. Wanted to, but haven't. Ambiguity is if you use a double meaning or ambiguitive language to mislead or misrepresent the truth. Just kind of like beating around the bush a little bit. So like when the judge asked the defendant why he hadn't paid his parking fines, he said that he shouldn't have to pay them because the sign said fine for parking here, and so he naturally presumed that it would be fine to park there. Very silly, but you know, I also kind of feel like that argument could work. The gambler's fallacy. That's if you say that runs occur to statistically independent phenomena such as roulette wheels. So that's a little bit confusing. So let's look at the example here. Red had come up 6 times in a row on the roulette wheel, so Greg knew that it was close to certain that black would be up next. Suffering an economic form of natural selection with this thinking, he soon lost all of his savings. And it is kind of like, it is a gambler's fallacy. It's like, because this thing has happened so much, it's probably going to happen again, so it's safe to bet on it. It's not, because there's not any certainty that it's going to happen again.
I don't even understand that. What's the point?
To win more money. Bandwagon is if you appeal to popularity or the fact that many people do something in order to validate what you're doing. And it's basically like the, if all your friends jumped off the bridge, would you? It's that kind of thing. Their example's fun though. Seamus pointed a drunken finger at Sean and asked him to explain how so many people could believe in leprechauns if they're only a silly old superstition. Sean, however, had had a few too many Guinness himself and fell off his chair. I don't actually think that's a very good example, but it is funny.
Seems cool.
Appeal to authority is that if you think that because an authority says something that it must be true.
Oh, like bootlickers.
Yeah, like bootlickers. Like if we just like agreed with everything that Mr. Nykirk says because he's the principal, like he's still human, he can still be wrong sometimes. That's, you know, teachers as well, like we do actually, most of us want you to like question us and make sure that we know what we're doing, make sure we know what we're doing. But you know, if you believe everything blindly, then you're not really thinking for yourself, and oftentimes we are wrong because we're human. Composition or division is when you assume that one part of something has to be applied to the whole thing, or that the whole must apply to its parts. So their example here, Daniel was a precocious child and had a liking for logic. He reasoned that atoms are invisible and that he was made of atoms, so he must be invisible too. I mean, like you see the logic, but it's not good logic. The no true Scotsman fallacy is if you make an appeal to purity, sort of, the example will make this make more sense, as a way to dismiss relevant criticisms or flaws of your argument. So their example here, Angus declares that Scotsmen do not put sugar on their porridge, to which Lachlan points out that he is a Scotsman and does put sugar on his porridge. Furious, like a true Scot, Angus yells that no true Scotsman sugars his porridge. It's kind of like not allowing for individuality. Like if you were really a Scotsman or whatever, you would do this thing, and kind of invalidating them as a result of that. Genetic. That's if you judge something as either good or bad on the basis of where it comes from or who it comes from. Like if you just inherently distrust everything the media tells you because you're like, oh, it came from the media, or like even a particular news channel, which that's kind of hard because some news channels are terrible. Black or white is if you present two alternative states as the only possibility. It has to be either this or this, when in fact there's this whole world of possibilities in between. So their example here, while rallying support for his plan to fundamentally undermine citizens' rights, the supreme leader told the people they were either on his side or they were on the side of the enemy. And a lot of people are actually probably somewhere in between and don't like either one of them. Begging the question, come on, is if you present a circular argument in which the conclusion was included in the premise. And people actually use this phrase wrong all the time because they'll say like, and this begs the question, and all they really mean is that it presents the question, but begging the question is a specific thing, where it's like circular reasoning. Their example here, the word of Zorbo the Great is flawless and perfect. We know this because it says so in the great and infallible book of Zorbo's best and most truest things that are definitely true and should not ever be questioned. There's flawed logic in the very title of this book, so none of the rest of it is really going to work out in a logical manner. An appeal to nature is if you argue that something, just because something is natural, oh hey, Trinae got kicked out, that just because something is natural is therefore valid, justified, inevitable, good, or ideal. Their example here is actually a really good one. The medicine man rolled into town on his bandwagon offering various natural remedies such as a very special plain water He said that it was only natural that people should be wary of artificial medicines such as antibiotics. I mean, honestly, like this is a pretty common fallacy for anti-vaxxers.
Yeah, something people who get on Instagram talking about like that the drop thing something
The what?
little like the little the lavender drops that you put in your
Oh, essential oils.
yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I have known someone before, and like, I'm not trying to attack anybody's beliefs or anything, but I've known someone who had a child with actual mental disabilities, and they were like, that's okay, we're gonna fix it with essential oil and prayer. And I'm like, oh boy, that's not okay. Not saying don't use essential oils or pray, but also like be reasonable. Uh-huh. Hmm? Yes. Okay, we've got two more and then I'll let you go. Or maybe three. Anecdotal is if you use your own personal experience or like one isolated example to prove something true. And I'll kind of turn the example into my own. My grandpa smoked for most of his life. And even when he died, like up until he died, his doctor was like, genuinely, what kind of cigarettes do you smoke? Your lungs are so clean. I don't know like how you haven't been affected by all these years of smoking. So if I used that to be like, smoking's totally fine for you. My grandpa's lungs were clean and he smoked his whole life. That's one isolated example that even like his doctors were like, how did that happen? I don't know. For the record, he had like lots of other kinds of cancer. So I don't think that smoking probably helped all those things, but you can't just use that one thing as an example. All right, two left. The Texas sharpshooter which is if you cherry pick a data cluster to suit your argument or find a pattern to fit a presumption. So their example here, the makers of sugarette candy drinks point to research showing that of the 5 countries where sugarette drinks sell the most units, 3 of them are in the top 10 healthiest countries on earth. Therefore, sugarette drinks are healthy. No, they're not. Like presumably it's a candy drink. It's probably really sugary. They probably just have like a really healthy lifestyle in other areas. Well, it says of the 5 countries where sugarette drinks sell the most units. So they're selling a lot, they're drinking a lot, but they're still in the top 10 healthiest countries. So they've probably got other things like they exercise more, they have smaller portion sizes, they don't have as many fatty foods as other countries. And lastly, middle ground, which is if you claim that a compromise or a middle point between 2 extremes must be the truth. So their example here, Holly says that vaccinations cause autism in children, but her scientifically well-read friend Caleb said that this claim had been debunked and proven false. Their friend Alice offered a compromise that vaccinations must cause some autism, just not all autism. No, like that's not how it works. That's not how science works, first of all, but it's also not how logic works. And there was the other one that's kind of the opposite of this, black and white. It's not true that you have to be one thing or the other, but if you're not one thing or the other, the very middle is not always the truth. Like there's usually gray area, or someone's just right. So like I said, you don't need to know all of these different terms. You just want to be able to kind of recognize when you're seeing flaws in logic. And to that end, first of all, I'm going to write Aria a pass to the bathroom. And then we're going to read a little story. Aria, restroom, go. On Canvas, it's this document that says love is a fallacy. And I have mine open, so I'm just going to pull it up since I'm still sharing my screen with you guys. And this is a really fun short story that shows how normal people use these fallacies all the time and why they're so flawed. So this is a story called Love is a Fallacy. Cool was I and logical, keen, calculating, perspicacious, acute, and astute. I was all of these. My brain was as powerful as a dynamo, precise as a chemist's scales, as penetrating as a scalpel. And think of it, I only 18. It's not often that one so young has such a giant intellect. Take, for example, P.D. Bellows, my roommate at the university. Same age, same background, but dumb as an ox. A nice enough fellow, you understand, but nothing upstairs. Emotional type, unstable, impressionable. Worst of all, a faddist. Fads, I assume, are the very negation of reason. To be swept up in every new craze that comes along, to surrender oneself to idiocy just because everyone else is doing it. This to me is the acme of mindlessness. Not, however, to Petey. One afternoon, I found Petey lying on his bed with an expression of such distress on his face that I immediately diagnosed appendicitis. Don't move, I said. Don't take a laxative. I'll get a doctor. Raccoon, he mumbled thickly. Raccoon? I said, pausing in my flight. I want a raccoon coat, he wailed. I perceived that his trouble was not physical, but mental. Why do you want a raccoon coat? I should have known it, he cried, pounding his temples. I should have known they'd come back when the Charleston came back. Like a fool, I spent all my money for textbooks, and now I can't get a raccoon coat. Can you mean, I said incredulously, that people are actually wearing raccoon coats again? All the big men on campus are wearing them. Where have you been? In the library, I said, naming a place not frequented by big men on campus. He leaped from the bed and paced the room. I've got to have a raccoon coat, he said passionately. I've got to. Petey, why? Look at it rationally. Raccoon coats are unsanitary. They shed, they smell bad, they weigh too much, they're unsightly, You don't understand, he interrupted impatiently. It's the thing to do. Don't you want to be in the swim? No, I said truthfully. Well, I do, he declared. I give anything for a raccoon coat. Anything. My brain, that precision instrument, slipped into high gear. Anything, I asked, looking at him narrowly. Anything, he affirmed in ringing tones. I stroked my chin thoughtfully. It so happened that I knew where to get my hands on a raccoon coat. My father had had one in his undergraduate days. It now lay in a trunk in the attic back home. It also happened that Petey had something I wanted. He didn't have it exactly, but at least he had first rights on it. I refer to his girl, Polly Espy. I had long coveted Polly Espy. Let me emphasize that my desire for this young woman was not emotional in nature. She was to be sure a girl who excited the emotions, but I was not one to let my heart rule my head. I wanted Polly for a shrewdly calculated, entirely cerebral reason. I was a freshman in law school. In a few years, I would be out in practice. I was well aware of the importance of the right kind of wife in furthering a lawyer's career. The successful lawyers I had observed were, without exception, married to beautiful, gracious, intelligent women. With one omission, Polly fitted these specifications perfectly. Beautiful she was. She was not yet of pin-up proportions, but I felt that time would supply the lack. She already had the makings. Gracious she was. By gracious, I mean full of graces. She had an erectness of carriage, an ease of bearing, a poise that clearly indicated the best of breeding. At table, her manners were exquisite. I had sent her the cozy campus corner at eating the specialty of the house, a sandwich that contained scraps of pot roast, gravy, chopped nuts, and a dipper of sauerkraut, without even getting her fingers moist. Intelligent, she was not. In fact, she veered in the opposite direction, but I believed that under my guidance, she would smarten up. At any rate, it was worth a try. It is, after all, easier to make a beautiful dumb girl smart than to make an ugly smart girl beautiful. This narrator is just awful. Petey, I said, are you in love with Polly Espy? I think she's a keen kid, he replied, but I don't know if you call it love. Why? Do you, I asked, have any kind of formal arrangement with her? I mean, are you going steady or anything like that? No, we see each other quite a bit, but we both have other dates. Why? Is there, I asked, any other man for whom she has a particular fondness? Not that I know of. Why? I nodded with satisfaction. In other words, if you were out of the picture, the field would be open. Is that right? I guess so. What are you getting at? Nothing, I said innocently and took my suitcase out of the closet. Where are you going? Asked Petey. Home for the weekend. I threw a few things into the bag. Listen, he said, clutching my arm eagerly, while you're home, you couldn't get some money from your old man, could you, and lend it to me so I could buy a raccoon coat? I may do better than that, I said with a mysterious wink, and closed my bag and left. Just to catch you up, this narrator is gonna see if his roommate will give up his girlfriend in exchange for a raccoon coat, which is what he really wants.
Oh,
And the girl is like beautiful and lovely, but she's really dumb. And he's like, well, I need a good wife, and if I could smarten her up, she'd be a great wife.
oh, this is the plot to every cheesy early 2000s movie.
Look, I said to Petey when I got back Monday morning. I threw open the suitcase and revealed the huge, hairy, gamey object that my father had worn in his Stutz Bearcat in 1925. Holy Toledo, said Petey reverently. He plunged his hands into the raccoon coat and then his face. Holy Toledo, he repeated 15 or 20 times. Would you like it? I asked. Oh, yes, he cried, clutching the greasy pelt to him. Then a canny look came into his eyes. What do you want for it? Your girl, I said, mincing no words. Polly? He said in a horrified whisper. You want Polly? That's right. He flung the coat from him. Never, he said stoutly. I shrugged. Okay, if you don't want to be in the swim, I guess it's your business. I sat down in a chair and pretended to read a book, but out of the corner of my eye, I kept watching Petey. He was a torn man. First, he looked at the coat with the expression of a waif at a bakery window. Then he turned away and set his jaw resolutely. Then he looked back at the coat with even more longing in his face. Then he turned away, but with not so much resolution this time. Back and forth, his head swiveled, desire waxing, resolution waning. Finally, he didn't turn away at all. He just stood and stared with mad lust at the coat. It isn't as though I was in love with Polly, he said thickly, or going steady or anything like that. That's right, I murmured. What's Polly to me or me to Polly? Not a thing, said I. It's just been a casual kick, just a few laughs, that's all. Try on the coat, said I. He complied. The coat bunched high over his ears and dropped all the way down to his shoe tops. He looked like a mound of dead raccoons. Fits fine, he said happily. I rose from my chair. Is it a deal? I asked, extending my hand. He swallowed. It's a deal, he said, and shook my hand.
Oh, he sucks.
I had my first date with Polly the following evening. This was in the nature of a survey. I wanted to find out just how much work I had to do to get her mind up to the standard I required. I took her first to dinner. Gee, that was a delish dinner, she said as we left the restaurant. Then I took her to a movie. Gee, that was a Marvy movie, she said as we left the theater. And then I took her home. Gee, I had a sensation time, she said as she bade me good night.
Idiot.
I went back to my room with a heavy heart. I had gravely underestimated the size of my task. This girl's lack of information was terrifying, nor would it be enough to merely supply her with information. First, she had to be taught to think. This loomed as a project of no small dimensions, and at first I was tempted to give her back to Petey. But then I got to thinking about her abundant physical charms and about the way she entered a room and the way she handled a knife and fork, and I decided to make an effort. I went about it, as in all things, systematically. I gave her a course in logic. It happened that I, as a law student, was taking a course in logic myself, so I had all the facts at my fingertips. Paul, I said to her when I picked her up on our next date, tonight we're going over to the knoll and talk. Ooh, terrific, she replied. One thing I will say for this girl, you would go far to find another so agreeable. We went to the knoll, the campus trysting place, and we sat down under an old oak, and she looked at me expectantly. What are we going to talk about? She asked. Logic. She thought this over for a minute and decided she liked it. Magnif, she said. Logic, I said, clearing my throat, is the science of thinking. Before we can think correctly, we must first learn to recognize the common fallacies of logic. These we will take up tonight. Wow, dow, she cried, clapping her hands delightedly. I don't know where I got enthusiastically. I winced, but went bravely on. First, let us examine the fallacy called dicto simpliciter. By all means, she urged, batting her lashes eagerly. Dicto simpliciter means an argument based on unqualified generalization. For example, exercise is good, therefore everybody should exercise. I agree, said Polly earnestly. I mean, exercise is wonderful. I mean, it builds the body and everything. Polly, I said gently, this argument is a fallacy. Exercise is good is an unqualified generalization. For instance, if you have heart disease, exercise is bad, not good. Many people are argued by their doctors not to exercise. You must qualify the generalization. You must say exercise is usually good or exercise is good for most people. Otherwise, you've committed a dicto simpliciter. Do you see? No, she confessed, but this is Marvy. Do more, do more. It'll be better if you stopped tugging at my sleeve, I told her. And when she desisted, I continued. Next, we take up a fallacy called hasty generalization. Listen carefully. You can't speak French. Petey Bellows can't speak French. I must therefore conclude that nobody at the University of Minnesota can speak French. Really? Said Polly, amazed. Nobody? I hid my exasperation. Polly, it's a fallacy. The generalization is reached too hastily. There are too few instances to support such a conclusion. Know any more fallacies? She asked breathlessly. This is more fun than dancing even. I fought off a wave of despair. I was getting nowhere with this girl, absolutely nowhere. Still, I'm nothing if not persistent. I continued. Next comes post hoc. Listen to this. Let's not take Bill on our picnic. Every time we take him out with us, it rains. I know somebody just like that, she exclaimed. A girl back home, Eula Becker, her name is. It never fails every single time we take her on a picnic. Polly, I said sharply, it's a fallacy. Eula Becker doesn't cause the rain. She has no connection with the rain. You are guilty of post hoc if you blame Eula Becker. I'll never do it again, she promised contritely. Are you mad at me? I sighed. No, Polly, I'm not mad. Then tell me some more fallacies. All right, let's try contradictory premises. Yes, let's, she chirped, blinking her eyes happily. I frowned, but plunged ahead. Here's an example of contradictory promises. If God can do anything, can he make a stone so heavy that he won't be able to lift it? Of course, she replied promptly. But if he can do anything, he can lift the stone, I pointed out. Yeah, she said thoughtfully. Well, then I guess he can't make the stone. But he can do anything, I reminded her. She scratched her pretty empty head. I'm all confused, she admitted. Of course you are, because when the premises of an argument contradict each other, there can be no argument. If there is an irresistible force, there can be no immovable object. If there is an immovable object, there can be no irresistible force. Get it? Tell me more of this keen stuff, she said eagerly. I consulted my watch. I think we'd better call it a night. I'll take you home now and you go over all the things you've learned. We'll have another session tomorrow night. I deposited her at the girls' dormitory where she assured me that she had a perfectly terrific evening, and I went glumly home to my room. Petey lay snoring in his bed, the raccoon coat huddled like a great hairy beast at his feet. For a moment, I considered waking him and telling him that he could have his girl back. It seemed clear that my project was doomed to failure. The girl simply had a logic-proof head. But then I reconsidered. So does the narrator. I had wasted one evening. I might as well waste another. Who knew? Maybe somewhere in the extinct crater of her mind, a few embers still smoldered. Maybe somehow I could fan them into flame. Admittedly, it was not a prospect fraught with hope, but I decided to give it one more try. Seated under the oak the next evening, I said, our first fallacy tonight is called ad misericordiam. She quivered with delight. Listen closely, I said. A man applies for a job. When the boss asks him what his qualifications are, he replies that he has a wife and 6 children at home. The wife is a helpless cripple. The children have nothing to eat, no clothes to wear, no shoes on their feet. There are no beds in the house, no coal in the cellar, and winter is coming. A tear rolled down each of Polly's pink cheeks. Oh, this is awful, awful, she sobbed. Yes, it's awful, I agreed, but it's no argument. The man never answered the boss's question about his qualifications. Instead, he appealed to the boss's sympathy. He committed the fallacy of ad misericordiam, which is basically appeal to emotion. Do you understand? Have you got a handkerchief? She blubbered. I handed her the handkerchief and tried to keep from screaming while she wiped her eyes. Next, I said in a carefully controlled tone, we will discuss false analogy. Here is an example. Students should be able to look at their textbooks during examinations. After all, surgeons have x-rays to guide them during an operation. Lawyers have briefs to guide them during a trial. Carpenters have blueprints to guide them when they're building a house. Why then shouldn't students be allowed to look at their textbooks during an examination? David likes this one. There now, she said enthusiastically, is the most Marvy idea I've heard in years. Thank you. Polly, I said testily, the argument's all wrong. Doctors, lawyers, and carpenters aren't taking a test to see how much they've learned, but students are. The situations are altogether different, and you can't make an analogy between them. I still think it's a good idea, said Polly. Nuts, I muttered. Doggedly, I pressed on. Next, we'll try hypothesis contrary to fact. Sounds yummy, was Polly's reaction. Listen, if Madame Curie had not happened to leave a photographic plate in a drawer with a chunk of pitch blende, the world today would not know about radium. True, true, said Polly, nodding her head. Did you see the movie? Oh, it just knocked me out. That Walter Pigeon is so dreamy. I mean, he fractures me. If you can forget about Mr. Pigeon for a moment, I said coldly, I would like to point out that that statement is a fallacy. Maybe Madame Curie would have discovered radium at some later date. Maybe somebody else would have discovered it. Maybe any number of things would have happened. You can't start with a hypothesis that's not true and then draw any supportable conclusions from it. They ought to put Walter Pigeon in more pictures, said Polly. I hardly ever see him anymore. One more chance, I decided, but just one more. There's a limit to what flesh and blood can bear. The next fallacy is called poisoning the well. How cute, she gurgled. Two men are having a debate. The first one gets up and says, my opponent is a notorious liar. You can't believe a word that he's going to say. Now, Polly, think hard. What's wrong? I watched her closely as she knit her creamy brow in concentration. Suddenly, a glimmer of intelligence, the first I had seen, came into her eyes. It's not fair, she said with indignation. It's not a bit fair. What chance has the second man got if the first man calls him a liar before he even begins talking? Right, I said exultantly, 100% right. It's not fair. The first man has poisoned the well before anybody could drink from it. He's hamstrung his opponent before he could even start. Polly, I'm proud of you. Pshaw, she murmured, blushing with pleasure. You see, my dear, these things aren't so hard. All you have to do is concentrate, think, examine, evaluate. Come now, let's review everything we've learned. Fire away, she said with an airy wave of her hand. We're going to end like just in time. Heartened by the knowledge that Polly was not altogether a cretin, I began a long, patient review of all I had told her. Over and over and over again, I cited instances, pointed out flaws, kept hammering away without let up. It was like digging a tunnel. At first, everything was work, sweat, and darkness. I had no idea when I would reach the light, or even if I would. But I persisted. I pounded and clawed and scraped, and finally I was rewarded. I saw a chink of light, and then the chink got bigger, and the sun came pouring in, and all was bright. 5 grueling nights with this took, but it was worth it. I had made a logician out of Polly. I had taught her to think. My job was done. She was worthy of me at last. She was a fit wife for me, a proper hostess for my many mansions, a suitable mother for my well-heeled children. It must not be thought that I was without love for this girl. Quite the contrary. Just as Pygmalion loved the perfect woman he had fashioned, so I loved mine. I decided to acquaint her with my feelings at our very next meeting. The time had come to change our relationship from academic to romantic. Polly, I said, when we next sat beneath our oak, tonight we will not discuss fallacies. Oh, gee, she said, disappointed. My dear, I said, favoring her with a smile, we've now spent 5 evenings together. We've gotten along splendidly. It's clear that we're well matched. Hasty generalization, said Polly brightly. I beg your pardon, said I. Hasty generalization, she repeated. How can you say that we're well matched on the basis of only 5 dates? I chuckled with amusement. The dear child had learned her lessons well. My dear, I said, patting her hand in a tolerant manner, 5 dates is plenty. After all, you don't have to eat a whole cake to know that it's good. False analogy, said Polly promptly. I'm not a cake, I'm a girl. I chuckled with somewhat less amusement. The dear child had learned her lessons perhaps too well. I decided to change tactics. Obviously, the best approach was a simple, strong, direct declaration of love. I paused for a moment while my massive brain chose the proper word. Then I began. Polly, I love you. You're the whole world to me, the moon and the stars and the constellations of outer space. Please, my darling, say that you will go steady with me, for if you will not, life will be meaningless. I will languish. I will refuse my meals. I will wander the face of the earth, a shambling, hollow-eyed hulk. There, I thought, folding my arms. That ought to do it. Ad misericordiam, said Polly. I ground my teeth. I was not Pygmalion. I was Frankenstein, and my monster had me by the throat. Frantically, I fought back the tide of panic surging through me. At all costs, I had to keep cool. Well, Polly, I said, forcing a smile, you certainly have learned your fallacies. You're darn right, she said with a vigorous nod. And who taught them to you, Polly? You did. So that's right. So you do owe me something, don't you, my dear? If I hadn't come along, you never would have learned about fallacies. Hypothesis contrary to fact, she said instantly. I dashed perspiration from my brow. Polly, I croaked, you mustn't take all these things so literally. I mean, this is just classroom stuff. You know that things you learn in school don't have anything to do with life. Dicto simpliciter, she said, wagging her finger at me playfully. That did it. I leaped to my feet, bellowing like a bull. Will you or will you not go steady with me? I will not, she replied. Why not? I demanded. Because this afternoon I promised Petey Bellows that I would go steady with him. I reeled back, overcome with the infamy of it. After he promised, after he made a deal, after he shook my hand. The rat, I shrieked, kicking up great chunks of turf. You can't go with him, Polly. He's a liar. He's a cheat. He's a rat. Poisoning the well, said Polly, and stop shouting. I think shouting must be a fallacy too. With an immense effort of will, I modulated my voice. All right, I said, you're a logician. Let's look at this thing logically. How could you choose Petey Bellows over me? Look at me, a brilliant student, a tremendous intellectual, a man with an assured future. Looking at Petey, a knothead, a jitterbug, a guy who'll never know where his next meal is coming from. Can you give me one logical reason why you should go study with Petey Bellows? I certainly can, declared Polly. He's got a raccoon coat. The end. Isn't that fun? That's a good. Yes, I can.
Oh, wow.
Ooh, raccoon. Raccoon coat.
That is so odd. My aunt has that, and my aunt's 60.
I would think like these stripes would be part of the thing. That's so funny.
Are you serious?
She learned her lessons all too well.
That whole ugly coat.
First so warm though.
The
Yeah, this one's gross.
deserves to get slapped for even trying to give that away.
That's so
That's
funny.
It's trash.
All
It's
right.
a Goodwill.
Well, we don't have an assignment for this or anything. We just wanted to start getting you guys familiar with it, so that you can recognize some of these flaws in logic when you see them, whether you know what they're called or not. You know what's happening if someone is like, oh, everything you're disagreeing with everything this person says because you don't like them, not because their arguments are bad. You can recognize that. Or like slippery slope, just because one thing happens doesn't mean that all these other things are going to happen. It's just kind of an extra step of critical thinking to analyze whether the arguments are sound or not. But on that note, my throat is starting to get a little bit hoarse, so I'm gonna let you guys go.
Okay, I have the hard question.
Bye, have a good weekend.